My wife emptied our accounts with her lover. My brother helped launder the money. Even my daughter was used as a pawn. They planned to leave me with nothing, but I'm an engineer. I don't scream, I calculate, and I made sure they lost everything. The pale gold of the morning sun filtered through the expansive windows of Lawrence Ashford's downtown office, casting elongated patterns across the polished floor. At 45, Lawrence exuded composed authority. His tailored suit, peppered silver hair, and a quietly intense gaze reflecting the discipline of a man who had built his reputation on salvaging doomed infrastructure ventures. Behind him, a wall adorned with accolades and framed schematics whispered the stories of bridges, tunnels, and highways brought back from the brink by his mind. That morning, Lawrence reviewed the final phase calculations for the Midtown Overpass revitalization, a project he had inherited in disarray but transformed into a shining example of urban renewal. The numbers were clean, the risk matrix optimal. All that remained was the board presentation. His assistant Eliza notified him the meeting was about to begin. The revised budget forecasts had been appended to the slides, and quiet congratulations lingered in the air, although Lawrence preferred not to assume outcomes prematurely. The boardroom was quiet after his final slide. His restructured plan eliminated delays and cut projected costs significantly. The executives were visibly impressed, and the promotion to Director of Strategic Development followed without contest. Despite the warm reception, Lawrence's mind was already occupied with upcoming tasks. He never viewed success as a resting point. Back at his office, he reached out to Rowena, his wife of over 2 decades. She acknowledged his promotion but mentioned being delayed at a client meeting. The background ambience, filled with lively noise and clinking dishes, contrasted sharply with the usual stillness of her design studio. She attributed it to a creative session with Dominic Hale, the wellness consultant she had begun collaborating with months ago. Lawrence had met Dominic once, the kind of person who smiled too wide, spoke too smoothly. Shortly after ending the call, Lawrence reviewed their joint account. Another withdrawal appeared, this time labeled as an interior consultation. The sum was nearly $5,000. He took note. Traffic on the drive home was dense. By the time he entered their impeccably styled residence, a dull pressure had formed behind his eyes. The house was quiet, a common scene lately. Rowena was still out, and their daughter Tess was upstairs. In his study, Lawrence paused mid-reach for his medication. Through the open-plan space, Tess' voice floated down clearly from her room. She was speaking to a friend, unaware of how well the house carried sound. The conversation revealed more than Lawrence had anticipated. Dominic was often present, occasionally even picking her up. Plans to relocate to Colorado were mentioned, hinging on the completion of tuition payments. Lawrence was described as predictable and uninteresting, someone easy to work around. He sat in the dark for a long while, the pain behind his eyes forgotten. Lawrence chose not to confront anyone. Instead, he listened more intently in the days that followed. Rowena's absences multiplied. Tessa's sudden interest in distant medical schools became more pointed. Offhand comments about a man named Greg, a new startup, and a vague mention of early investments began to form a pattern. Greg was his brother. Always smooth-talking, always on the verge of something great, always irresponsible. At work, Lawrence made quiet inquiries. Among the firm's contracted investigative partners was a name that stood out, Gideon Strathmore. Former intelligence, now focused on private asset recovery and fraud investigations. They met in a distant cafe, chosen carefully to avoid familiarity. Lawrence presented his concerns about Dominic Hale and offered an initial retainer. Within days, Gideon responded with a detailed report. Dominic's credentials were fabricated. No legitimate certifications existed. His background included revoked licenses, allegations of manipulation, and a consistent method of ingratiating himself with affluent women under the guise of holistic support, eventually gaining access to their finances. Rowena had authorized a series of large transfers under vague labels. Their timing matched Dominic's integration into her life. Even more alarming, Greg's startup had received funds through a shell company named K&H Ventures, established just weeks after Dominic appeared. The circle widened. Neighbors were not merely friendly. They were complicit. The Carltons had accepted a substantial loan from Rowena. The Fairchilds benefited under the pretense of community support initiatives. Lawrence documented it all. That evening, he sat surrounded by city lights and silence. There was no confrontation, no outburst, only planning. He traced each thread of betrayal, mapping every player and transaction. He did not see the situation as collapse. It was a pre-demolition survey. The structure was compromised, yes, but its weaknesses made it easier to dismantle and rebuild. Tomorrow, the disassembly would begin, not with accusations but with evidence. Not with emotion but with method. Because Lawrence Ashford was not merely a betrayed husband. He was an engineer, and he knew precisely where to strike first. Each morning that followed became part of a calculated rhythm for Lawrence Ashford. The betrayal had not broken him. Instead, it sharpened his senses and resolved his purpose. From the outside, nothing had changed. He was still the meticulous director, still the devoted husband, still the father offering polite nods and timely tuition payments. But internally, the project had begun. One more complex than any urban renewal plan had ever overseen. Lawrence began compiling data, financial statements, surveillance images, unusual calendar entries. He reviewed Tess' credit card activity, noting frequent visits to establishments close to Dominic's known apartment address. Ride-sharing transactions coincided suspiciously with Rowena's client meetings. Patterns formed with almost architectural elegance. Every deception layered like substructure beneath a failing bridge. He discovered K&H Ventures had funneled over $280,000 into Greg's startup in under 6 months. The funds had originated from joint accounts masked under ambiguous descriptors. College costs, home design expenses, wellness retreats. The money had moved cleanly through accounts created for the sole purpose of obfuscation. Greg's role was larger than anticipated. Shell contracts and padded invoices masked fake consultations. His charm, once harmless, now served as the lubricant for fraud. The neighborhood's complicity was confirmed. The Carltons had received $40,000, categorized as a personal loan. The Fairchilds had pocketed $35,000 in the guise of community donations. Both families provided alibis for Rowena's fabricated meetings, their silence bought with Lawrence's own funds. Even Tess's involvement deepened. She wasn't just an unknowing pawn. Lawrence uncovered records of her picking up sealed envelopes and visiting bank branches. GPS data from her phone, combined with timestamps, painted a troubling picture. She had helped move money between accounts registered to shell corporations. Whether she fully understood the implications or not, she had participated. Meanwhile, Gideon Strathmore continued to work in the background. His methods were unobtrusive, his findings damning. Dominic had established similar patterns in 3 previous states, each time seducing affluent women, draining them financially, and vanishing once legal consequences loomed. 2 of his previous victims had lost their homes. One, a widow from Nevada, had taken her life shortly after losing everything. Dominic had left no trace of guilt. The house grew quieter. Rowena's stories became more elaborate. Her calls, more frequent but less informative. Lawrence no longer listened to the content of her words but to the intervals between them, the nervous pauses, the rehearsed laughter. The woman he had married had turned into a stranger who saw him only as an obstacle to her reinvention. Lawrence revisited the trust he had established for Tess' education. It had been designed with stringent protections, irrevocable GPA requirements, limited use clauses. He modified it further, ensuring no withdrawal could be made without dual authorization and quarterly reviews. Tess would graduate debt-free, but with an indelible understanding of what her complicity had cost. To sever access discreetly, Lawrence met with their bank's trust division. The senior officer confirmed that once new compliance protocols were in place, Rowena would no longer be able to move funds freely. The joint accounts would remain open, a trap waiting to be sprung. Preparations expanded. Lawrence arranged for the purchase of a penthouse apartment under a blind trust, slowly relocating essential personal and professional items over several weeks. His departure would be clean, quiet, absolute. The next step involved Rowena's father, Bartholomew Crane. The retired judge had advised her throughout the covert divorce strategy. Gideon had retrieved detailed notes of their meetings, plans on how to frame Lawrence as emotionally absent, how to cite professional commitments as grounds for spousal entitlement. Lawrence met the former judge at a civic gala, masking confrontation behind polite smiles and harmless conversation. Crane's overconfidence revealed more than he realized. When Lawrence mentioned bringing financial records for estate planning review, a flicker of concern passed through the older man's gaze. The seed of fear had been planted. Then came the catalyst. During a midweek project meeting, Lawrence received an alert. An attempted transfer from the joint account had triggered a freeze protocol. Within minutes, Gideon confirmed the scene. Dominic inside a bank branch downtown, Rowena waiting outside in a parked sedan. Lawrence said nothing. He let the panic bloom. Messages poured in. Rowena asking about blocked access. Greg wondering about delayed transfers. Dominic attempting contact from a number Lawrence had never seen before. All went unanswered. Later that evening, Lawrence contacted the bursar at Tess University, confirming that any future tuition disbursements would require his direct authorization. He ensured the trust terms were fully enforced and logged the attempt to breach it. Tess arrived at his home office the next day, visibly agitated. Her accusations, parroting Rowena's narrative, struck hollow. Lawrence didn't argue. He showed her documentation, the transaction records, photographs, courier logs. Her expression shifted from anger to disbelief. The realization of her role was immediate and devastating. Lawrence remained composed. Her education was secure, he assured her. But trust, once violated, could not be reconstructed with apologies. She had made her choice. Now she would live with it. That night, Rowena returned home with Dominic. The confrontation that followed was one-sided. She accused, denied, pleaded. Dominic postured. Lawrence listened, then calmly laid out the evidence. Bank statements, timelines, victim testimony from Dominic's past, Tess' role as an unwitting courier of laundered funds. They left his office shaken. That was the first crack. The collapse had begun. The demolition was no longer theoretical. It was underway, progressing on schedule and without a single miscalculation. Lawrence Ashford had built bridges, repaired foundations, and saved collapsing structures. Now, he was applying that same mastery in reverse. Not every structure deserved to stand. Some were only useful as lessons. And this one was going to fall completely. In the days following the initial confrontation, Lawrence Ashford's strategy advanced from data gathering to tactical execution. The preliminary cracks had appeared. Now it was time to widen them, to push weight into structural weaknesses until the entire deceptive framework collapsed. He worked methodically. While Rowena maintained her rehearsed routines and Dominic faded temporarily from view, Lawrence began implementing the final stages of financial isolation. He met again with Gideon Strathmore, who now operated as more than an investigator. He was a strategic ally in an engineered dismantling. Greg's startup, Silas Quinn Technologies, was the linchpin. Lawrence reviewed the fraudulent consulting contracts with increasing clarity. Each invoice bore exaggerated figures for services never rendered, funneled through K&H Ventures and other ghost entities. Strathmore uncovered evidence of misrepresented investor funds, payments for non-existent clients, and forged compliance reports. It was enough to trigger interest from federal authorities. Simultaneously, Lawrence completed the transfer of all personal assets to protected accounts and trusts. Property titles, investment portfolios, and intellectual rights were moved to legally shielded vehicles. Rowena, once granted partial control over shared assets, now faced a landscape of inaccessible vaults and terminated authorizations. Strathmore provided surveillance footage confirming the affair's escalation. Meetings between Rowena and Dominic at Greg's office became increasingly open, their sense of invulnerability evident in body language. Tess' vehicle was also frequently present. Her role, whether willing or not, remained a critical link. Lawrence established a secure communications archive and encrypted storage containing every piece of evidence. Testimonies, bank records, property transactions, flight bookings, GPS metadata. Every betrayal recorded, cataloged, preserved. From his penthouse, Lawrence drafted the initial wave of disclosures. The SEC would receive a full report on Silas Quinn Technologies, including source funds, intermediary laundering strategies, and the fraudulent use of shell corporations. Anonymous tips, substantiated by verifiable documentation, would initiate investigations without revealing Lawrence directly. Next came the personal front. He prepared a comprehensive divorce filing that cited financial conspiracy, asset misappropriation, and evidence of coordinated fraud. Included in the submission were notarized witness statements, security footage, and correspondence logs. To prevent sabotage, Lawrence pre-scheduled filing and notification times. Rowena would be served the morning she expected to finalize a California property purchase. Dominic would discover his financial access revoked the same day. Silas Quinn would face audit notices before noon. The timing was flawless. He composed personalized packets for the Carltons and Fairchilds, each containing evidence of their participation. Proof of wire transfers, false alibis, and signed statements implicating them as accessories. Lawrence didn't need to confront them. Exposure alone would collapse their involvement. Bartholomew Crane remained the final wildcard. Strathmore's report on the retired judge revealed a history of influence trading, discreet lobbying for favorable court assignments, and consultation fees routed through anonymous donations. Lawrence collected every relevant file. Once the fraud case reached public courts, Crane's association would be scrutinized under a new lens. Late one night, Lawrence sat in silence as an encrypted drive finalized its backup. The city below pulsed with indifference. The Midtown Overpass, his most visible project, stood completed and gleaming beneath fresh LED lighting. In contrast, the personal structure he had trusted, the one he built through marriage, family, and loyalty, stood gutted. By morning, Lawrence activated the cascade. The SEC received the digital dossier on Silas Quinn Technologies. Cross-reference documents highlighted conflicts of interest, suspicious transfers, and ties to known shell entities. Parallel to this, internal alerts were triggered within the bank systems used by Rowena and Dominic. All suspicious activity flags went live. Tess received a final statement from the trust office, reaffirming her fund's conditions, its legal protections, and Lawrence's sole administrative authority. She also received the surveillance timestamp log, each time she had unknowingly delivered laundered assets. At 9 a.m., Rowena was served divorce papers alongside a cease and desist for access attempts on protected accounts. Dominic, who attempted to contact her minutes later, discovered his accounts frozen. His pending property contract in Denver was halted due to sudden withdrawal rejections. Greg's office, meanwhile, was visited by agents requesting immediate access to digital records. His panicked call to Lawrence went unanswered. His investors began demanding clarity. By noon, Crane's office received a notice of inquiry into past judicial conduct, citing anonymous evidence regarding bias in financial settlements. By evening, the network began to unravel. Rowena's messages turned from denial to bargaining. Dominic disappeared from all shared locations. The Carltons removed social accounts. The Fairchilds listed their house for sale. And Lawrence? He spent the evening reviewing site blueprints for a proposed harbor reclamation project. The work was routine, the calculations steady. The background noise of collapse didn't disturb him. By midnight, every component of the fraud had been exposed. Each actor's secret involvement now stood recorded in legal filings or pending investigations. Lawrence saved a single image on his desktop, a screenshot from the bank transfer logs, showing the exact moment Dominic's final withdrawal attempt failed. A small victory. Quiet, absolute. Tomorrow would bring formal hearings, depositions, restructuring. Lawrence would face them all with the precision of a builder who understood every bolt and bearing. This wasn't revenge. It was resolution. And the demolition was nearly complete. The morning after the collapse began, Lawrence Ashford rose early. The city outside his penthouse shimmered under a haze of post-rain humidity, but his mind was clear. The machinery had been set in motion, And now the results began surfacing like cracked pavement beneath a washed-out road. By mid-morning, headlines trickled through professional news circuits. Federal investigations targeting emerging tech startups had launched, with Silas Quinn Technologies listed among the initial inquiries. Anonymous sources cited financial misconduct, fraudulent contracts, and corporate laundering through shell intermediaries. Lawrence had stayed anonymous, but the trajectory of the exposure followed a trail only he could have charted. At the same time, Rowena was beginning to realize the scope of what had occurred. Her access to accounts remained denied. Attempts to contact Dominic yielded no response. The funds meant for a down payment on the Colorado property had been redirected, blocked mid-transfer by freeze protocols. Her messages turned from confusion to disbelief. Dominic, it turned out, had not anticipated the loss of control. His calls to mutual acquaintances revealed panic. With accounts frozen, pending charges on multiple properties defaulted. Strathmore's surveillance showed him withdrawing from his social routines, disconnected and increasingly erratic. Greg, too, faced public fallout. His investors demanded answers as news of the SEC inquiry intensified. Office servers were seized, and digital forensics experts began analyzing email records and transaction histories. Lawrence received no fewer than 5 messages from his brother that day, each more frantic than the last. He answered none. That afternoon, Lawrence finalized the divorce filings with his legal team. Eliza Thorne, his counsel, reviewed each clause. Evidence packets were complete. Financial fraud, co-conspiracy, misappropriation of marital funds, and negligent risk to the family estate. The filings referenced documentation from multiple jurisdictions, tying Rowena's decisions to Dominic's history of manipulation. One clause ensured Tessa's trust fund would remain sealed from any future claims. Another established that any attempts to access joint holdings would trigger additional legal action. With everything prepared, Lawrence returned home. The penthouse, sparsely furnished and efficient, offered no distractions. He reviewed additional footage sent by Strathmore. Images of Rowena sitting in her parked car, staring at her phone, motionless. At another point, she was seen entering the Carltons' home, leaving visibly shaken less than 20 minutes later. Word had reached the neighborhood. The Carltons and Fairchilds had turned inward. Their roles, once casual and dismissive, had become liabilities. Now exposed, they distanced themselves quickly. Bank records, provided in the legal discovery package, showed that both families received substantial undocumented funds from Rowena, money now traceable to laundered joint accounts. That night, Lawrence received a knock on the door. Tess stood there, visibly exhausted. Her tone was subdued. She had read the final trust statement, reviewed the surveillance footage, and understood the implications. Though her involvement had not been deliberate, the evidence proved complicity. Lawrence offered her no absolution. He reiterated that her education was protected, but her place in his life had been altered permanently. As she left, Lawrence returned to his work. Drafting infrastructure assessments had become a form of meditation. His team in Seattle had just submitted blueprints for a coastal stabilization initiative. The calculations came easily. In a world full of variables, engineering offered constants. By the end of the week, fallout continued to spread. Judge Bartholomew Crane had been summoned for deposition regarding his involvement in multiple divorce cases where asset divisions had been suspiciously favorable to a handful of clients. An independent review board had begun analyzing rulings for patterns, and though his formal retirement had occurred years prior, his influence remained a subject of legal scrutiny. Rowena attempted once more to reach Lawrence, this time through her attorney. A message was relayed. She wished to avoid public proceedings, preferred a quiet settlement, and wanted to speak about Tess. Lawrence declined the request. There would be no private discussions, no off-record reconciliations. Dominic, according to Strathmore, had begun liquidating possessions. His property in Arizona was quietly listed, and he had approached 2 past victims for loans, both refused. Reports indicated a formal complaint had been filed in Nevada, prompting a potential criminal review of his past activity. The storm had moved beyond Lawrence's control, but he no longer needed to guide it. His role had been to initiate the collapse, to identify the vulnerable supports and remove them with precision. The rest followed naturally, like gravity working through weakened steel. That weekend, while the city buzzed with political fallout, Lawrence attended a charity architecture summit as keynote speaker. He delivered a brief presentation on sustainable design and long-term load distribution in civic structures. The applause was modest but respectful. No one in the audience knew that the same principles he described had governed his personal dismantling of betrayal. It had all been about pressure, timing, and endurance. He had waited long enough, applied just enough force, and never looked back once demolition began. That night, as he overlooked the city from his private balcony, a final report from Eliza arrived. All filings were accepted. All freezes held. The case had passed the point of reversal. Lawrence closed the file. The demolition, for all intents and purposes, was complete. 5 years later, the skyline of Seattle stretched across the horizon, sharp and defined against a canvas of morning light. Lawrence Ashford stood in the corner of his high-rise office, reviewing updated schematics for a transit innovation hub. At 50, his presence remained composed, the product of discipline, resilience, and an unwavering belief in structure, both physical and moral. The past had become distant, though never erased. His career had only accelerated. 3 major public infrastructure projects bore his signature. 2 national design awards rested behind glass. His team, now numbering over 100 engineers and specialists, operated with precision, each cog in the mechanism reflecting his philosophy. Purpose, not sentiment. His assistant, now a composed professional named Neil Lennox, entered with the day's agenda. Among the notes was a message from Eliza Thorne back on the East Coast. The legal aftershocks from his former life had not yet fully faded. According to Eliza's update, Rowena Blair now worked in retail. The boutique design firm she had joined had closed within 18 months. She had moved twice in the past 3 years, each time downsizing. Her financial stability remained fragile, and court-mandated repayments toward legal costs still followed her. Attempts to reopen claims against Lawrence's asset protections had failed. Dominic Hale had not resurfaced in any significant professional circles. After being convicted for fraud involving multiple women, he had served time before being released on parole. New allegations had followed him soon after, triggering renewed scrutiny. His once polished facade had cracked entirely under pressure. Silas Quinn, formerly Greg, had settled in a smaller city under a different surname. Following the investigation and asset seizure by the SEC, he was never formally imprisoned but had been barred from holding executive positions in any registered enterprise. He worked now, reportedly, in used vehicle sales. Bartholomew Crane's posthumous reputation had not fared better. Investigative reports published over the last 2 years detailed decades of judicial manipulation. Former clients and rival attorneys contributed to a revised legal ethics review of his cases, several of which had been overturned. The Carltons had divorced. The Fairchilds sold their property under distressed terms. Both families remained under quiet observation by financial institutions. Tess Ashford had graduated from medical school with distinction. Her GPA had remained above the trust threshold. She had completed her residency and now worked at a medical center in the Midwest. Monthly emails still arrived in Lawrence's inbox. They expressed updates, occasional reflections, and subtle apologies, though none asked directly for reconciliation. Each was archived unread, as agreed. That afternoon, Lawrence attended a formal ceremony where he received an award for civic leadership. He accepted it with quiet humility, offering a speech centered on urban resilience and ethical responsibility. Cameras flashed. Reporters noted his reserved nature, his focus on systems rather than self. He returned home to a minimalist penthouse on the northern waterfront. The space was silent, ordered, efficient. On his desk lay another email from Tess, timestamped just hours earlier. She mentioned her promotion, her gratitude for the protected education, and a hope, tentative, cautious, that someday they might speak again. Lawrence read the message but did not reply. His role had never been that of a redeemer. He had been a builder, a planner, and at the time when it mattered most, an executor of calculated justice. Outside, the city shimmered in glass and steel, a testament to structure and will. His eyes drifted toward a familiar silhouette, the Midtown overpass, still strong, still serving thousands daily. The irony was not lost on him. Some structures endure because they are properly maintained. Others must be demolished before anything lasting can rise in their place. That night, a local news feature aired about the revival of infrastructure projects across the country. One segment covered Seattle's rapid transformation. Lawrence's name was mentioned alongside archival images of the projects he had designed and rescued. His achievements were contextualized, framed by discipline, not drama. The final email he opened that evening was from Eliza. All legal matters were officially closed. Every filing completed. Every account audit verified. The last contested appeal had been dismissed without hearing. The system finally had reached equilibrium. Lawrence shut down his workstation and stepped onto his balcony. Below, the city buzzed, indifferent to the past. He allowed himself a rare moment of stillness, not to reflect, but to recognize. The blueprint of vengeance had been executed flawlessly. No miscalculations. No collapses he hadn't anticipated. What had once been a personal disaster had become a professional triumph in disguise. Not one born of revenge, but of restoration. And now, with nothing left to dismantle, Lawrence Ashford turned toward the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. The future.